All right. Good morning. Jackie, thank you so much for joining us. It's such a pleasure to have you. So I guess just to welcome everyone, thank you everyone for joining our October general meeting for New York City VOAD. So today we are honored to have Jacqueline Patterson join us, and she's the founder and executive director of the Chisholm Legacy Project. And it's a resource hub for Black frontline climate justice leadership. The mission of the Chisholm Legacy Project is rooted in a just transition framework, serving as a vehicle to connect Black communities on the front lines of climate justice with the resources to actualize visions. So prior to the launch of the project, Patterson, or Jackie, served as the senior director of the NAACP Environmental and Climate Justice Program for over a decade. During her tenure, she founded and implemented a robust portfolio, which included serving the state and local leadership whose constituencies consisted of hundreds of communities on the front lines of environmental injustice. She also led a team in designing and implementing a portfolio to support political education and organizing work executed by NAACP branches, chapters, and state conferences. Since 2007, she has dedicated her career to intersectional approaches to system change. Her passion for social justice led her to serve as a coordinator and co-founder of Women of Color United, Senior Women's Rights Policy. So today's discussion, we're gonna focus on her article. So it's called Defining the Climate Continuum in the Context of Cyclical Black Displacement. Just so everyone knows, we did put the link in our chat, so feel free to follow along. It's called again, Displaced on Repeat, Black Americans and Climate Forced Migration. So feel free to follow along with the article. Just to preface a little bit, this article delves into the interconnected history of displacement and forced migration experienced by Black people in America, tracing it from the transatlantic human trafficking to the present-day climate crisis. It underscores how these experiences are not isolated events, but are deeply rooted in systematic racism. Just as we recognize the historical underpinnings of the challenges faced by Black Americans, we must view climate change as part of the same continuum, which its drivers and impacts deeply entwined in systemic issues. So today's discussion will explore, excuse me one second. Sorry about that. So today's discussion will explore the intricate relationship between displacement, migration, and climate change, highlighting the environmental abuse that disproportionately affects Black communities and the devastating consequences of the catastrophic climate change. The pre-existing circumstances of displacement, housing insecurity, and socioeconomic disparities make Black communities exceptionally vulnerable to the effects of a system that both drives climate change and exacerbates its impact. So when I read this article, Jackie, I felt that it was a call to action, emphasizing the urgent need for systemic change and community-centered solutions to address the ongoing challenges faced by Black communities at the intersection of displacement and climate change. So would you be able to share with members some highlights and what's your take on this?
Thank you. Thank you all for having me. It's really an honor to be here, and also just admiring that you even want to delve so deeply on this topic. So thank you. Yeah. So just to, I guess, elaborate a little bit on the intersections, as you said. So we see the climate forced migration as part of this continuum, which is why we call the article Displaced on Repeat, like as part of this continuum of displacement, and climate change being just the latest driver of displacement of Black folks, but also other racialized peoples for sure. And so, but we were kind of speaking from the eye in terms of what we've experienced. So whether it has been from from birth, and particularly as we talk about Black Americans in the United States the uh, in terms of the birth of our time in the United States, I guess I would say, these colonized lands that we call the United States. And so from the time that we were taken from our ancestral lands, our original homes, and brought over, in as cargo and ships, we were displaced from our homes. From the times that we were out there working the fields and had to keep working the fields even during and after childbirth, were times when we saw the beginnings of the premature births that happens with, and so we're displaced from the home in the womb even before we were ready to be in the world. The ways that we were then displaced even as a people once there was emancipation from enslavement, there was a kind of a nomadic way that people had to be as they were trying to find home after emancipation. And then, of course, we know the people who were escaping, and again, the terrifying ways that people had to search for a home. So even from then, we see that premature displacement. And then fast forward to today in climate forced migration, there's so many ways that whether we're displaced from home still, in terms of the countries that we lived in, because of the disasters that are taking place, because of the drying up of the breadbasket in different places. Those are some of the first ways that we get displaced from country, and having to seek a place where there is an abundance, as we have in the United States, and people are just seeking a place to be able to survive, unlike the narratives around people kind of coming to seek our riches. People are literally just trying to survive. There's a quote that I put in the paper that I often use in conversation from Warshan Shirway, a Kenyan-born Somali poet, where she says, "No one puts their child in a boat unless the water is safer than the land." And that is a circumstance that we find ourselves in, where it's a matter of survival that forces us to move. And then within the United States, once people even get here, then there is the challenges around being, whether one has come over through legal channels or otherwise, the problems of being having varying immigration statuses in the United States then becomes yet another place of insecurity and displacement. So I'll start there because I want to just kind of keep going over, but that's the framing that we put forward in Displaced on Repeat.
Thank you so much for that. And I just want to also share with the audience that this is an open discussion. So feel free to put questions in the chat or go off mute and ask a question. But I'll kick it off. So can I just ask, Jackie, what economic and social implications are associated with climate-induced migration for Black Americans, and how can these challenges be mitigated?
Yeah, thank you. So some of the economic and social challenges is, first, just starting with social. We know the anti-immigrant sentiments that too often are pervasive. We know that there have been, very informed from whether it's just kind of not treating people well to actual hate crimes against people who have immigrated. So socially, there has been a rise in just anti-immigrant hate and discrimination and so forth. So just socially, that is obviously a extreme challenge socially, emotionally, and it also conveys to even how people are able to live in community. One of the communities that we worked with, they actually, some folks were having a meeting, and they insisted that when people were coming into the meeting, they asked them to show their papers, one person, and so literally for a community meeting. So these are the kind of social challenges that folks are finding. And then when we talk about economics, the matters are many. First, just in terms of being able to work in the country is a challenge depending on immigration status. And then even when one is able to find work, that it's often not at a living wage. In different circumstances, we have the whole kind of farm workers and domestic worker situation. And it's a good thing that we have now these farm worker alliances and the domestic worker alliances, so that people can start to see more in the way of rights. But even within those contexts, often Black folks don't necessarily trust to join these alliances because they're afraid that they're going to be targeted. Or again, with the social component, there can be anti-Black racism within certain union efforts, and so there's a whole extra dimension there that can take place. But but outside of the context of unionization or kind of workers aligning, then there is extreme challenges around worker abuse that happens, and people don't feel like they have much choice in terms of work opportunities. And then in the context of being re-traumatized in some way or re-injured by climate change, even once they're here, then people who have immigrated have less of an opportunity in terms of home ownership. And we know that home ownership is tied to so many of the resources that are out there, including and most especially in the post-disaster context. And I know who I'm talking to, so you all know that all too well. And so if there is a disaster situation that people who have immigrated here experience, then the challenges there are even more pronounced in terms of being able to get resources. And I'll also say in the context of disasters, there's been situations where people who in the immigrant workforce have been subject to raids after disasters, and when by ICE. And so these are the other kind of situations we're finding as well. So those are just a few illustrative examples around economic challenges.
Yeah, and I think that's
I'll also just add, sorry, this ties the social and the economic. I do a lot of work around gender justice, and one very common challenge is that women who end up in domestic violence circumstances, and because they're either economically dependent or they're afraid of exposure in terms of their immigration status, then people all too often are having to stay in domestic violence circumstances. So that's just yet another challenge.
And I think that's actually a perfect segue to speak about policy changes. So like, what policy changes are needed at the local, state, and federal level to ensure that Black communities are adequately protected and supported in the face of climate-induced migration?
Yeah, thank you. So a number of different things are needed. One is, in some places, we know that just in the interim, while we try to have policies set up, that people have established sanctuary, whether it's sanctuary cities, sanctuary schools, sanctuary churches, and so forth. And at the very least, we should not have people trying to block this. So we know in certain states, people have actually all but outlawed having sanctuary mechanisms in place. So that's definitely, we want to have a welcoming, and embrace of the various sanctuary circumstances that people have set up. So that's a bare minimum. And then we also need to really have look at our immigration policies in the first place, and how do we provide, how do we recognize that the US is 4% of the global population and 25% of the emissions that drive climate change. So we have a responsibility, even if we weren't going to just be a good neighbor because of the abundance that we have, we should at least take responsibility for the fact that we are the ones that are causing people to have to leave their lands between yeah. And so we need to completely rethink and overhaul our immigration policies, and do much better about having a welcoming stance as it relates to immigration. And I know that there are obviously complications in different places if we don't have the resources in place for that, because people if our systems aren't prepared to receive as people come through, then it does harm to both the people who are trying to hold the system and the people who are going through the system. So I'm not trying to oversimplify that situation, but it's to say that we do need to do better about having a welcoming environment in terms of our immigration policy making. Then also, as it relates to the economic opportunities, then included in that is making sure that people do have a pathway, a clearer pathway to employment, for sure. And with that, also a clear pathway to housing opportunities and so forth is going to be critical to ensure that people don't continue to have these traumatic situations. In addition to that, making sure that we have gender responsive policy making as well, because of what I've said before in terms of domestic violence, that we have differential opportunities, and kind of, again, sanctuary, safe places for women to be able to for anyone in a domestic violence situation to be able to engage without fear of reprisal. So again, we need to remove the fear from our existence as immigrants, and ensure that the policies all are towards that end. So really removing fear and providing security. Those are a few illustrative examples. I mean, I could get into universal basic income, which we were able to do successfully in the context of COVID-19. And we've seen places where they have done universal basic income at the city level, and have seen a reduction in people who are unhoused, have seen a rise in people who are employed, because once they have that basic, then they actually go out and get jobs so that they can go from there. They just need that leg up. So I think we need to be thinking about some mechanisms like that in order to ensure that people do have that leg up to then be able to get firm grounding and be able to earn an income through employment means. So there are a few illustrative examples. Thank you.
Thanks. And Jackie, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I also want to just share, because I noticed some members have joined in a little late. This is an open discussion, so feel free to go off mute and ask a question or put any questions in the chat. So Jackie, are there specific regions or cities in the US where the effects of climate change are disproportionately affecting Black communities, and what strategies are being implemented to address these issues?
Yes. So there are places where, so unfortunately, because of between housing insecurity, we know Black communities are more likely to be housing insecure, and the history of redlining and so forth has led to that, as well as kind of ongoing modern day discrimination. And so with that, it makes it so that in some ways, wherever we live, there's a differential impact, a differential vulnerability, and so forth. So that's definitely true. We also have So wherever we live, where there is a disproportionate placement of toxic facilities in our communities, this also makes it more likely for us to be displaced when it comes to the fact that disasters make these toxic facilities even more harmful potentially, as the toxins, the whatever materials that these facilities utilize then become either airborne, or they're running through the streets. As the facilities get compromised, you have these liquids and substances running through the streets and soaking into the soil and getting into playgrounds and so forth. So and where we have landfills, then landfill waste can then become unearthed and go through communities. So there's so many different ways that we as that when we have this kind of disproportionate placement next to toxic facilities, that this combines with disasters to bring folks differentially into harm. So between that and the fact that we as communities are more likely to be in floodplains, and so that means any place where it's flooding, we're more likely to be displaced in that kind of situation. We're more likely to have compromised housing stock. So, and again, all of this ties to the history of economic challenge, and so it means that the that our houses are more likely to be damaged or destroyed in the context of disasters, which then leads to a greater likelihood of displacement. So geographically, yes, places that have these types of toxic facilities, places that have floodplains, but unfortunately, that's kind of throughout the country. And that's where we end up being. And so there's certainly places where you hear more stories coming out, like the Gulf region, because there's just more going on in terms of hurricanes and so forth, or the eastern seaboard, because again there's more going on in terms of hurricanes and storms and so forth. But also through the Midwest, there's more increase in frequency and severity of other extreme weather, whether it's flooding from just precipitate from rain, or tornadoes and so forth. So we see where those impacts happen as well, but definitely the Eastern Seaboard and the Gulf, you're hearing more, and I think that's also because of the concentration of population as well.
Mm-hmm. So New York City BOED is it's over 40 plus, it's a coalition of over 40 plus nonprofit organizations. We also work with a lot of government agencies on the city, state, and federal level. So this is the perfect audience, I guess, to ask this question. And how can government agencies, nonprofits, and community organizations collaborate to better support Black Americans who are displaced due to climate-related events?
Yeah, thank you. So one is just, what I'm sure folks are already doing to some extent, and that we need more investment in, is being in dialogue with those communities, so that those communities actually lead on their solutions. We've seen time and time again that when communities lead, that we all win, and that the communities are best equipped to talk about their own circumstances. So definitely starting there with making sure that we're in deep dialogue, not just with communities on a whole, but that we're differentially in dialogue with not just Black communities even, but folks within Black communities who can be marginalized and therefore have double, triple jeopardy. So ensuring that we are having those conversations with women about the gender justice situation, but also others about gender justice situation, that we're in dialogue with LGBTQ plus populations about the differential vulnerabilities that are there, because we know that people are more likely to be unhoused, and that there's a high degree of teen folks who are unhoused, and also the people who have experienced challenges even within the shelter system, post disasters and that kind of thing. So making sure that we're really in dialogue with kind of whether it's Black veterans, Black people who are differently abled, like I said, Black LGBTQ, like the different subsets of the population that could be even more vulnerable, marginalized, disenfranchised by our system. Secondly, I would say making sure that one of the things that we're actually thinking about putting out, I just was a reviewer on a federal funding application. And as we all know, there is this Justice 40 initiative that's where they're trying to make sure that at least 40% of funding goes to infrastructure improvements in disadvantaged communities. But I was struck that yes, the application very much and the rubric for scoring the applications put a lot towards making sure that you're engaging on equity and inclusion with these populations, and that there was good language there, but that there is not enough guidance out there for people who are seeking these applications. And also, as a reviewer, I wondered who the other reviewers are and the extent to which they're able to discern between when an application uses the word disadvantaged a lot versus actually engaging deeply with the communities that it's purporting to serve. And so another thing that we can do, across, government agencies and nonprofits and so forth, is to make sure that as these really billions of dollars are coming down and seeking to serve communities, that we have high standards as it relates to the aims, the intent, and the methodology for centering frontline community leadership in implementing these infrastructure improvements and putting together programs that are aimed at demarginalizing and truly ensuring that people are served. And so those are a couple of things I would say. Also, specifically thinking about how do we think about programming that doesn't just kind of like I was speaking to one of these philanthropists who was trying to get involved around climate change, and they said, well, I've done work around housing, which was easy. We just give people a home, or food was easy because we just give people something to eat. So I think that simplification, that oversimplification, doesn't really take into account that we need to be thinking about systems change in order to be able to transform people's relationship with these resources. So how do we think about, between the governments and frontline community groups and nonprofits, how do we think about institutionalizing community ownership, community local self-reliance, community self-determination, as opposed to some of the short-term measures that we see, even the way some of these funding opportunities are structured. They're structured for more short-term, top-down, as opposed to building the base and building autonomy and self-determination. So really thinking and working with frontline communities hard about how do we be transformative as opposed to just service-oriented.
Thank you. Does anyone have questions from the audience? Kimberly?
I see Kimberly has raised her hand.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much for your presentation. There's been a lot of fantastic information. One of the things that you were just mentioning as ways that, governments can also help. And as a side note, I work for our FEMA Region 2. We've been looking to have discussions and dialogue with a lot of vulnerable communities, and we found that it can be very hit or miss sometimes. Sometimes we have groups that are really interested in engaging with the dialogue, and sometimes we have people that perhaps it's re-traumatizing to be speaking to government people, or there's still a lack of trust. And so they're not as willing to engage in that dialogue with us. And so I was wondering if you had any thoughts or advice about how we make sure that we are including these groups, that we are showing trust and making sure that we get their valuable input.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very good question. Even recently in my own organization, we put out a survey, like a kind of a, what would you like to see survey? And one of the team members are like, what are you really going to do with this in the end? Like, are you actually going to make these changes, or are we just going to be putting this out there? So in full transparency, it happens at all in so many places. And so that and actually also in full transparency, our team is unionizing, and so that's going to actually, I welcome that to help with making sure that people feel like they have agency, they have power in a situation, and that they have the mechanisms to really organize and collectivize the wants and needs. And I would say that would be the key, is to ensure that, and again, this is where we need to get creative with how we're utilizing the resources at hand. So if, for example, it would be possible for FEMA to have a community consultation grant that they would give to someone in the community that does, where there is trust, like it's an intermediary or community group that, where when they call, the community will come, and so the community can come together, organize themselves, and have that resource to be able to do it, and then together they would be in conversation with FEMA at that point. That would be one thing that I've seen that has actually worked, where, and it kind of in some ways mirrors what I just described in terms of the unionization, where people are like, okay, now we've got a mechanism to have collective voice and to have some power in the situation. And I would also say too, having had this conversation with FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, where it was a similar dynamic, and we talked about to what extent can the Office of Public Participation have more of, well, first do what I just said in terms of helping folks to be able to organize locally, but then also what are the ways that that group can be bestowed with some level of assurance that that what they do, what they say, will actually not just be kind of considered or dismissed, but that there could actually be some assurance that it'll go somewhere. And I think that's really a critical piece, to figure out how to articulate and how to institutionalize some level of power that communities will have in that relationship. That's what I would say is a basic response. Yeah.
Io, I saw that you also had a question.
I do. So, on your website, there's a quote that I'm very familiar with, and I would just like to read, and I would like you to talk about the relationship between incarceration, dehumanization, and environmental injustice. You have in many ways already, but there is a direct link. But the quote is by Malcolm X, and it says, "I have no mercy or compassion in me for a society that will crush people and then penalize them for not being able to stand up under the weight." Can you speak a little bit to what that means in terms of incarcerate? Well, actually, I mean, it's beyond even that. It's, and the lack of equitable or even a good education, leading to families not being able to support themselves and take care of them, people being able to take care of themselves and their families, the dehumanization and many of the laws and policies, not just in New York, but around the country, kind of like, what is the word? The word would be, I guess, making Black behaviors illegal, and environmental injustice. I think that's a lot, but I know for sure you've got this. So
thank you. No, it is. That is thank you for that question and really comment in some ways, because as you say, there's so much there. I mean, the examples are many, and throughout that entire continuum of how of that very quote, from, as you say, from even when folks are parenting, and there is, instead of the ways to, besides kind of the failings of the quote unquote welfare system and the challenges there, but then that instead of like actually being able to provide a pathway to self-determination and independence and wellness, there is the punitive when people are engaged with the Department of Social Services systems that often took place there, that again were early times of family separation that happened, that then set us on a path. There is, as you say, with the education system, everything from the fact that people are even the way that the school finance system is set up, that school financing is directly tied to property values and property taxes. It again just reinforces and continue, like it almost, the not by, well, you start to wonder the questions about by design, but it kind of, but the message and the impact is kind of, you only deserve this much because you only have this much. So you don't, pardon? Yes.
no, I was just saying yes.
Yes, exactly. And the fact that so much is tied to property values, whether it's education system, even like sound barriers on highways, the levee system is tied to property values. And as we found out after Hurricane Matthew, when we learned that when they were doing the levee fortification after Hurricane Katrina, that the Army Corps of Engineers was using a formula to prioritize levees based on what the economic impact would be if the levee was overtaken. So right away, it actually institutionalized that the fact that those who are least able to recover, least able to protect themselves and so forth from a disaster are the ones who are least likely to have even a levee to block them from flooding. And so just in so many ways, there's so much that's tied to property value, and property value is low. And so the system is set up to kind of keep people in places and to penalize people for being poor, basically, and for being politically and economically disenfranchised. So, and then, yes, then we get all of this is our precursors to what we find in terms of the criminal justice system or the criminal injustice system, for sure, in terms of that people are left with so little in the way of opportunities or possibilities to be able to provide for themselves, to provide for their families, to have some measure of dignity in this existence. And yet people, when you see the level of disparity and opulence, even if you just turn on your TV or your radio, then that the amount of injustice that people feel in terms of I'm being made to feel that they must not be a good person if they're not able to achieve all of these riches that other people have been able to achieve. And without that kind of systemic analysis, that people can easily begin to take that on themselves. And when people feel that level of self-esteem challenges, anyway, there's just so much there. And then we have this criminal, quote unquote, injustice system that is really set up to just lock people away. It's not set up to actually do anything in regard to rehabilitation or just healing from the trauma that society has wrought on so many of the people who are incarcerated, not to mention mental health that has resulted from these extreme injustices. So you've really asked the prime question there. So thank you for that. There's so much. We could really talk about that for the entire rest of the time.
Absolutely. I just want you to know, by the way, I am from LES Ready, which is a Lower East Side Coalition of Disaster Preparedness and Long-Term Recovery Groups. As all of our member organizations for New York City VOAD are affiliated with this effort. I just want you to know that I cannot wait to review everything that is on your website and to otherwise connect with you so that people do not have to reinvent the wheel. Here's the research. Here's the analysis. Here is the information. Here's the education. And guess what? Here are the recommendations. Yeah. All right. So thank you. So this must have been extensive and exhaustive work, but in the name of Shirley Chisholm, we cannot do or expect anything less. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Does anyone else have any questions in the chat? I don't see any in the chat. All right. So Jackie, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, Racine, did we send the website link?
Yes.
Okay, great.
So, we started the chat with it. So again, if everyone wants to read the article, I did include the chat on the top. And then, Jackie, so I guess if we could just end off with this. So how can we ensure that the voices and perspectives of Black Americans are central in discussions and decision-making process related to climate change and displacement?
You said, how can we ensure that
the voices, I'm sorry. So how can we ensure that the voices and perspectives of Black Americans are central in decision-making processes related to climate change and displacement?
Yeah, thank you. I think some of the things that we talked about, I'm also going to put another link in the chat for folks of another paper that gets at some of the questions that Ayo asked earlier as well. So, and that's also the link.
Thank you for that.
Sure. So one is definitely ensuring that we do have better ways to engage communities and ensure that communities have power as it relates to engaging with our public offices. So whether it's the FERC and the Office of Public Participation and FEMA or other entities, we have to make sure that people don't feel like they're just potentially fruitlessly putting forward, but that there's some confidence given that what they share will actually be heeded, and that even if some things can't be heeded, that there is going to be every effort to follow community leadership. I think that is absolutely critical. I think that we need to ensure that as I was saying before, as we start to put forward these, whether it's the IRA and other monies that are coming down, that there is better and nuanced guidance on how to engage community leadership so that we don't have large organizations that have traditionally and currently disenfranchise those very communities. And at best, they might be mentioning them in a proposal, but you don't see them mentioned in the budget section, or you don't really see them communities named in a sense where you can actually go back and ask that community, are you actually a part of this? So we see some misrepresentation that goes on in those contexts, and we have to make sure that Justice 40 lives up to its name, and that we're talking about Justice 40 plus, that minimally 40% of these infrastructure dollars goes to these communities, and the communities are actually in the driver's seat of the resources that come to their communities. So those would be a couple of things that I would say.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. Okay, so I just want to thank you so much for shedding light on the deeply interconnected issues of Black displacement and the climate crisis. During this discussion, we were able to explore the continuum that ties these challenges together, from historical injustices of forced migration to the present day impacts of environmental racism. I just also want to highlight that the struggles faced by Black communities, from housing insecurity, so I love that you touched on that, to disproportionate exposure to pollution and climate impacts, are part of a larger systemic problem rooted in racism. It's evident that addressing climate change and its effects requires us to confront these systemic issues head on. So just to, as we move forward, I would like the group to remember that true progress can only be achieved by dismantling the systems that perpetuate harm and displacement, and believe that we can all commit to building a regenerative, caring economy that values every life and protects the planet. So I, again, want to just thank you again for your work. It's phenomenal. And to everyone who has joined this important conversation, it was definitely well overdue and needed. It is through collective action and a shared commitment to change that we can strive for a change, just and sustainable future for all. So did you want to share any last points before we conclude, or?
I just want to thank everyone for coming for this conversation as well, and just want to applaud you for organizing the conversation, and just say that I am here. I look forward to hearing from Io, since he specifically said you'd be reaching out. Looking forward to hearing that, and anyone else who would like to reach out. We are very much here for. That's what we exist for. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, and we'll be in touch. Take care.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, bye-bye.